you can join us on our various social media platforms like LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And for easy access, you can scan this QR code. I'm going to stay here for a few seconds so that you guys can scan the QR code and then we'll follow along. And we have a lovely moderator, Busy, as well. So in case you miss out on this QR code, she'll like put in the links in the chat box so nobody misses out on anything. So I guess we can move along. And now I would like to introduce Lauren. So she's a service designer at Steampunk, and she will be giving a lovely presentation on Data Governance 101. So I will now pass on this session to you, Lauren, and a hearty welcome to you.
Thank you, Siddhi. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining this afternoon here in DC. I say good afternoon, but we have a very diverse crowd today. And so I know that there's a lot of variance depending on where you are joining from in the world. And I'm very excited to see such a diverse crowd in this virtual audience. I saw people who have dialed in from Madagascar, Afghanistan, Spain, along with several people from DC, where I am based here in the United States. And I am very excited to see that. And I'm especially excited because that tells me there is more interest in the subject of data governance than one might believe. I first came up with the broad idea for this presentation when I pitched an idea for a book on the subject of data governance to publishers, tech publishers, because it was something that I was seeing as a major challenge in my work as a service designer. And I remember being told by the first editor that I pitched the idea to that she wasn't sure how much interest there would be in the subject. And I think whether you find the subject interesting or not, there's more than enough evidence that it is necessary, that it is lacking, and that there are a lot of misconceptions about what data governance is. And so that is what we are going to chat about today in this webinar. I will give an overview of data governance, what it is and is not. And I'll also talk about how it feeds into data architecture and production environments, because I think that is also a big disconnect I see. Even senior data leaders at the C-suite level still view governance as a completely separate endeavor from the rest of their technological pursuits, and the reality could not be further from the truth. So we will talk about how those two things intersect today. And so what I will cover in three broad buckets is the dilemma / dilemmas with big data as they exist today. Data itself is not new, but the volume of data being produced today is, and the lack of governance that I see both in my clients' workplaces and writ large tells me that there's a strong need for data governance. So we will get into more details about what that is. And then I am a service designer, as Siddhi mentioned, and so I will talk about how you can apply design thinking to data governance in order to drive your governance initiatives forward. So I want to start by giving a brief introduction to me and who I am. I am a civic tech service designer at a company called Steampunk. We are a federal government contractor based in the Washington, D.C. area of the United States, and our main client base is United States federal government agencies. I have been working as a service designer with Steampunk for 2.5 years, and I specialize in designing data/digital products that range from websites, doing website migrations from PHP to Drupal, designing the user interface for databases, working with the chief data officer of a federal agency on their service model and what services the chief data office should provide. So that's the type of work that I do in my full-time role. I am currently advising in a CDO at a U.S. federal agency on their data strategy, as mentioned. I just published a book on data governance and designing data governance from the ground up through the pragmatic programmers. So if you go to pragprog.com, you would be able to find the link to my book, and I will give a direct link to it at the end of this presentation. I am a new first-time author, and the print version of the book is available as of this month. So if you found the content content in this webinar valuable, I would be really honored for you to buy a copy of the book and write a review if you enjoy it. And I have 10 years of working in tech, both reporting on and working within the sector globally in North America and Europe. I have also been contributing to various open source initiatives for 5 years, ranging from Drupal and opensource.com, and also Women Who Code. I was an active participant in the Women Who Code DC chapter, where I learned to code and do programming for the very first time. So that's another reason I'm very excited to be speaking with you today. So this is kind of tongue-in-cheek. It's an obligatory intro slide where I show you, a formulaic way of saying that by X year, there will be Y amount of data generated, and I will give you a chart with a upward pointed arrow up to infinity, where we talk about how the amount of data today is really beyond our control. And there's certainly some truth to that, yet this has become a cliche, I would say, in many modern data presentations. And Jordan Tagani wrote a blog, this is from a blog post by Jordan Tagani on motherduck.com about the state of big data today, where he makes this exact case. And yet the reality is there are many challenges with big data today. Data volumes in one survey were found to have grown by 63% per month on average. That same survey found that respondents said the mean number of data sources in their organization was 400, which means that they are ingesting more data from more sources than ever before, along with all of the data that these organizations produce in and of themselves. 99% of respondents in this same survey said that they will migrate over to the cloud within the next 2 years. So migration from one cloud environment to another, or from an on-prem environment to another, is something that is continuing to occur. But 90% of execs in this survey said that it was hard for them to prepare their data for consumption and analytics. Many of our initiatives revolve around giving the right data to the right people in a timely fashion, and there are still many blockers to that seemingly simple task occurring. And the big reason I see for this is because change is hard. And these stats are from a separate survey that I referenced in my book, Designing Data Governance from the Ground Up. In that survey, 1 in 4 organizational leaders said that they were data-driven. So not only is that a very low number, that is a decrease from prior versions of the survey, which found that 38% of leaders said they're data-driven. And so the number of leaders who say that they are data-driven is decreasing while the volume of data continues to increase. This same survey found that technical hardships are a bigger blocker to being a data-driven org than the technical blockers. I am of the attitude that the challenges we face related to data and data governance are not technical in nature, they're cultural, because your culture determines your technical decisions. And so the survey's results found that to be true. And then these complement an oft-cited statistic that about 13% of machine learning models make it to production. That means that there is incalculable time, money, and effort wasted on models that never even make it to production environments, let alone succeed in the long term. And there is an article on Harvard Business Review, on Harvard Business Review's website right now. It came out within the last week, I think, and the headline is that just 3% of organizations have data that is of sound quality, which means that it meets quantitative quality standards. And so I do recommend reading that HBR article on their site alongside this webinar, because it goes into more details about what data quality is and the problems that organizations encounter in creating and managing quality data. And ultimately, this comes down to a line from a song, which is everybody wants to change the world, but no one ever wants to change themselves. And I think when we're talking about data initiatives and big data, the reality is we want to do all these grand things with data. Many of you maybe went into data science thinking that you would get to build these really intricate models to solve really cool business problems. That's probably the way that the role was sold to you. And you might have found that the reality of your day-to-day is very different. And that is due not as much to the essence of the role as much as the priorities and politics that drive your day-to-day experience. And most likely those politics can stymie a lot of your efforts, because data governance is fundamentally not a technical problem. It's a cultural challenge to design solutions for. And if you as a senior data leader are not willing to invest in that long-term systemic change, you can't expect to see higher quality data that is trustworthy. And we'll talk about trust in the context of data governance as well today. I am a firm believer that done well, data governance can help solve the problems we just talked about. And you might be wondering what data governance is. I refer to it as the people, processes, and tools used to co-create data standards that you can automate. If you need a soundbite or a way to distill what we talk about today into 3 words, I would say the 3 words I want you to walk away with are automate your standards. Because if you are not finding a way to manage and govern your data that is scalable and that is integrated into your tech environments, then its scope and impact is going to be limited to such an extent that I think it won't have much of an effect at all. And we'll talk about why. So again, data governance in this context is the people, processes, and tools used to co-create data standards that you can automate throughout your pipelines. And here's some more information about what data governance is and is not. I think it's important to put these side by side because a lot of misconceptions about governance exist and they often intersect. So data governance is a framework that you use that is all encompassing about the key areas of data that you need to govern. And this ranges from ethics to security to consumer trust in your data. All of these different areas have a role within the holistic framework that you should use for data governance. I talk in my book about a framework from Gartner. It's a 7-step framework for data governance that they recommend using. I did used to work for Gartner as a business intelligence analyst for 4 years, and I find that the framework they lay out is a strong way of looking at the issue of governance, because it shows you that governance is not one singular thing. It is not just security. It is not just ethics. It is an umbrella way of managing all aspects of that data work. Data governance is also stewardship / citizen data science. You might have heard the citizens data science term. It's another one that I heard often at Gartner, and it refers to colleagues within your organizations who do not have the training in data science that you all do, but they nonetheless have enough aptitude and expertise over the data in their domains that they are able to make decisions about that data, such as which metadata should be attached to which pieces of data. And it also references folks who are able to navigate through tools like Power BI or Google Analytics to get the data that they need in a timely manner. The book that I just wrote has a whole chapter on data stewardship, how to find and convince the right data stewards to join your governance efforts. And data governance really should be a co-created solution, which you can see here. As mentioned, data governance should also be integrated into your development. So the goal here is to create governance standards that are scalable and able to be automated so that you are not doing this work by hand. The volume of data that exists today is too large to be governed by any one organization or one person within the organization. So outsourcing all of this to your chief data officer or your data scientist scientist just isn't going to work, because every aspect of an organization today produces data. And so having those standards for data governance and quality that you can then integrate into your pipelines and into your production environments is really important. And finally, the last piece I want to, of a case that I want to make, is that data governance is human-centered and it should be co-created and co-owned. This is especially important when you are designing data governance from scratch, which is what my book is about. It's about establishing your first governance program for the first time and the work that you have to do in order to make it happen. And the reality is that because data governance is at its core a cultural transformation that drives digital transformation, you cannot do this work alone. It doesn't matter if you're the most senior data leader in your organization. If you don't have buy-in from the CEO and a sponsor, for an executive sponsor for your data governance council, buy-in from leaders across your organization who are going to help uphold and write these governance standards, ultimately the efforts will not succeed in the long term. And so if you are fundamentally not thinking about governance as a cultural endeavor that is centered on people, again, its impact will be limited. And on the right, I think it's equally important to define what data governance isn't, because there's a lot of confusion about that as well. Governance is not a singular role, tool, or technique. It's an all-encompassing way of talking about people, processes, and tools, but it is not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's also not top-down data ownership. Part of the reason initiatives like governance and the talk about data mesh exists today is that the current, more common top-down model of data ownership, where all data is centralized and owned by one department, typically IT, and then you have to make these ad hoc requests of that one department to get the data you need, that this is very quickly becoming an out-of-date way to manage and govern data. And it's especially problematic because this top-down model often means that folks who lack domain expertise about data are making decisions about it, and that in itself is going to create a lot of data quality problems that we see today. Data governance is also not purely compliance or legalese. I say this with the caveat that I do believe having a data steward with a legal background on your stewardship committee is really important, because that person can own the responsibility of surveying the legal landscape for data governance and management, and then integrate those new standards and policies into your processes as they arise. Having said that, a lot of people view governance purely as permissions about who can receive which data or what you can and cannot do with data, and that's just not true. It's also not a one and done lift and shift initiative. If people are on board with governance, they think of it as something they do either at the beginning of an effort, but actually I see it more commonly referred to at the end. I've had clients say, we'll finish this prototype and do data governance later. And so that's fundamentally thinking about it the wrong way. If you are not beginning a project with governance standards in mind, I would venture to say you might as well not do it at all, because you're going to have to retroactively do so much more work to recreate and evaluate what your team has done, and that's how you create technical debt. So I do think it's important to say what governance is and is not when we talk about what we are discussing here. And this is an example of data governance in action. When I was writing the book, I was somewhat surprised to see two unlikely sources of strong data governance in action, and those come from nonprofits and more specifically universities. Universities possess a lot of data that contains what's called PII, personally identifiable information, and they are accountable as nonprofits themselves to making sure that they secure this data and that people can trust that they are governing this data appropriately. And so quite a few universities actually have published manifestos on how they manage data. They even talk about how they utilize particular tools for governing data. So these examples here come from Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. It's a prestigious university in the United States. And if you go to each of these web pages, you will see that they have entire websites talking about what they believe data governance is, the benefits of it, who sits on their data governance councils. And I wanted to include the screenshot on the right because they actually even talk about how they use Calibra, which is a very popular data governance tool. The two tools that I most often see utilized for data governance are Informatica and Calibra. And so the Washington University in St. Louis actually talks about how they use Calibra, which I think goes to another level of governance in terms of talking about how they use the tool. I think that's a really strong model for data transparency. And if you look on the right, you'll even see WashU says that Calibra is the single source of truth for all of our data governance and stewardship activities, allowing to maximize the value of university data. And that single source of truth for all data governance and stewardship activities is really important because another challenge I run into with governance is the fact that clients have so much data that lives in disparate systems that do not talk to each other, that lack APIs, and then you ask stakeholders where data lives, and they very often have no idea. And so the fact that a case study like WashU has all of their data in a single source of truth, that already is a huge step towards effective governance. And I think it's a model worth exemplifying here. Now, you might have heard of a little concept called data mesh. If you are working as a data professional, you almost certainly have heard of data mesh, especially within the last year or two. It's what some might say the latest trend in data architecture. I personally think it's much more than that, and I see data mesh as a logical extension of data governance that results in what we call federated data governance. So when we talk about data governance, you already know that it's a strategy to manage the people, processes, and tools related to how your org stores data and metadata. Governance is standards, which share how your org collects, stores, processes, and destroys data. And it's scaled to improve / automate your service delivery. Now, you might be wondering, how does that relate to data mesh? And data mesh was introduced by Zhamak Dehghani when she was working at ThoughtWorks at the time. So she actually is now standing up her own startup to address and help scale data mesh across organizations. But she introduced this concept when she was still working at ThoughtWorks. And the biggest takeaway about data mesh is that it is architecture which promotes a data as products mindset. So you are managing data not as a service, but as a product. So if you have a product management background, I think that is really the ideal mindset to bring to data mesh efforts, because data mesh promotes managing products according to data domains. We will talk about data domains later in this presentation, but fundamentally, when you think about what your core areas of an organization are, which produce data, mesh allows you to manage these data domains as their own products within the architecture. Mesh keeps data available in this more self-service architecture, and it also ensures that data is formatted, stored, and discovered against clear, consistent standards that are equalized. And when you do this, you result in something called federated data governance. And this is where you automate your standards for data throughout the decentralized architecture environment. It also guides domain-specific data stewards through that process of accessing and building data products. And it defines parameters for how to build, define, access, and use data products within the data mesh. So the idea is that the decentralized architecture has all of your data in one place, but it also is more searchable and user-friendly so that your stewards can find the data that they need more easily. And there are some warnings that I feel compelled to share about data mesh. It was first mentioned in 2019. If you're doing the math, that's less than 4 years ago. And so it is still a young, evolving process. Like governance in itself, data mesh is not a singular tool, role, or standard. So if you've heard someone say, we will buy data mesh or speak of data mesh as a product in and of itself, that is fundamentally incorrect. And the other thing, and this is an argument that I would make, is that you cannot do data mesh without governance. There's a lot of talk these days about data mesh, and I'm constantly asked for examples of how data mesh is done well. And I give the same answer regarding data mesh that I do when people ask about doing machine learning and AI. I think the data world is very focused on the latest trends and frameworks and languages and how to implement them into their tech stacks. And the reality is that many times they have not done that fundamental governance work to establish quality standards to ensure that their data is fit for use, that it has met quality control, and when you haven't done that, you fundamentally will not be able to utilize AI and machine learning, which are technologies that rely on quality, consistent data. And data mesh is the same way. If you do not have governance, you won't be able to implement data mesh to its full effect, because data mesh, while I believe is the right way forward for data architecture, it is not without its complexities, and it does rely on governance. So that begs the question, if we are talking about data mesh and some warnings, if it's a new concept that in many ways is unproven, why consider it at all? I think there are 3 core tenets of data mesh that make it valuable. The first is that it is domain-driven design. This is where we talk about data as products, and this is where data domain owners, aka your data stewards, get the autonomy to know, own, and make decisions about the data in their areas of focus. And so what that means is let's say you have your customer success director, and they oversee all decisions about the customer success area of your business. They would be, in theory, the best person to know, own, and make decisions about customer success data. It does not mean that your customer success director needs to become a data engineer. It's actually the opposite. The idea here is that the customer success director creates the standards for data in their domain, which the data engineers then implement throughout the architecture. The data mesh also talks about autonomous domain teams. This does not mean that domain teams work in silos. It means that, again, they have that power to understand and make decisions about their data. And data mesh architecture thus supports data domain analysis. And finally, data mesh is decentralized microservice architecture, which means that it interconnects data to each other throughout the architecture. So this is like APIs in a microservice architecture environment. And it allows all of your data to live in one place while being managed by different domain experts. And then if you design your architecture to be interconnected, that allows people throughout the organization to more easily search for and find and use the data that they need for their own business use cases. And when we talk about the 4 phases of federated governance, we're talking fundamentally about 4 things. The first is interoperability. This defines the parameters that allow stewards to leverage data products across the data mesh. It's also documentation. This helps everyone learn how to find and use the data products that your stewards create. There's security, which sets role-based access by creating identity and access management policies within your cloud platform. And then there's compliance, which automates the requirements for things like legal rights, PII, et cetera, within your data mesh. I've talked a lot about how one of the benefits of data mesh is that you are able to access the data that you want within a decentralized environment. And that does not give anyone and everyone the right to access any data that they want at any time. That's why governance is so important. You need compliance standards for who can access which data within the data mesh, and then automating those compliance standards throughout the data mesh allows you to have a very quick way of seeing who can access, who's approved to access it and who is not. So this is a visualization of what federated data governance can look like in action. It's data standards that are integrated into your engineering practices. These go into an enterprise data lake, which controls your data scanning, measurement, access, lineage, and validation. And the end result in a perfect world is scalable, evidence-based data governance that is documented. You noticed that documentation was one of the 4 pillars of federated governance, and it is more important than ever. That is a great way within a data mesh to have a record of how your data is used in various business contexts. If someone comes to you asking on behalf of, let's say, GDPR legislation, how you used their data for your own professional purposes, if you have a data mesh environment, you should be able to go into a data catalog to figure out which how data pieces are defined. You should have data lineage tracking activated to be able to show how that person's information was utilized throughout your business. So these in action, when you integrate your standards into your engineering and your architecture, then you have data governance that is of sound quality, evidence-based, and documented, and all of that allows you to do more with the data that you have. I think the challenge that I continue to see, though, in making this a reality is that the former illustration was somewhat oversimplified, because if you don't invest in building a data-driven culture, your data mesh efforts are going to fail. And that's because if you want to reap the rewards of data mesh, you must co-create governance within your cross-functional teams. There is no way around this. If you are going to create decentralized architecture where all of your data lives, you have to involve people both on your technical team and beyond your technical team. And you also need to fundamentally view and speak about governance as a shared effort that is people-centric. And that does not mean that it's occurring outside of your technical conversations. They should really be integrated conversations because one affects the other. And that's really where I got the idea for the title of my book, Designing Data Governance from the Ground Up. I wrote the book for readers who believe in the value of governance. They know that how important it is to govern data, but are not sure where to start. And the book covers a lot more than what we have time for today, but I did want to share a few tips with you about how you can get started on your own governance journey or enhance your own governance journey if you're already there. The first step really is to answer 2 key questions. The first is, what is my company's mission statement and how does our data use fulfill that mission? The first question is so basic, it can almost seem offensive, because you might be thinking, I already know what my company does. It's obvious what my company does. Why do I need to define this in the context of data? This is a waste of time. I think it's important to ask everyone, no matter how senior they are, to answer this first question, because in my experience, you would be shocked at how many people, including senior executives, can't answer this question, or they answer this question in the form of talking about a tool or talking about what new functionality they want to add to their tech stack. They don't fundamentally answer the question of why their company exists in the first place. And if they can't answer that question, my guess is that they also don't have a clear understanding of how their company uses data to fulfill that mission. And if they don't understand and can't articulate how they use data to fulfill their company's mission, my guess is that they also lack documentation about which data they have. They can't answer questions about which servers it lives on. They don't know which formats data needs to be converted into in order to be put through pipelines. My experience has taught me that these two questions are a stopgap for determining if a client is ready to invest in governance. And so this, in my view, really is the crucial first step. The next step, once you have those two questions answered, is to define data domains. So we talked about domains as the key areas of your business that produce high-level data. So as one example, or to define your data domains, you're going to want to answer 4 key questions if you're not sure what those are already. The first is to discuss what your organization's key areas of interest are. This goes back to the mission statement. You want to also answer the question of which problem spaces your organization addresses. You want to be honest about how your organization is architected as is, both on the people and technology sides. So how is your organization structured? And finally, who leads each problem space and its associated data? This last question feeds into data domain ownership. You want to look for leaders of these domains throughout the organization, because they might not be so-called data experts or data scientists, but they are the people who are tasked with making those key strategic decisions about data throughout the organization. And you want to find who those people are. Because what you want to do first and foremost is create a business map showing what your data domains are. So this graphic was taken from a blog post on Towards Data Science. There is a link to the blog post on this page, but you can't currently see it. But I can talk to the organizers about sharing this deck so you can view this map in the context of the blog post itself. This is a business map which shows 4 key data domains and then the subdomains underneath. And so this is a hypothetical organization, but you can see these 4 data domains and then the different areas underneath. And these are the key areas that produce data for an organization. And it is important to define what those are. And once you have built that process map showing the key areas of your business that produce the most data, and once you have defined who those data domain owners are, you want to transition to getting them on board with serving as stewards of their respective data domains. Data stewardship is another concept that is very misconstrued and misunderstood. It's often thought of as a role you have to hire for. It's often thought of as extra work. And I will say that it can be, especially if you are a steward who is involved with designing your organization's first data stewardship program. But the reality is that data stewards are people in your organization who are already leading key decisions about your data domains. They are already doing this work and they are already affected by the data in their domains. And this is about decentralizing ownership of that data stewardship so that they're empowered to make those decisions. And then once you have defined your data stewards, you want to start defining data quality standards. So you'll notice over here, we have 4 areas of data stewardship that are high level. And then if we transition to quality standards, the idea is that you would have those data stewards co-create standards for quality across domains. Now, this is a very oversimplified graph, but it does show some criteria that you would want to use for data stewardship across these data domains. And there is an article at Lights on Data regarding this subject. It goes into the concept of data domain quality in more detail. You can see there is a link to it at the bottom of the slide, but again, I will try to get the slides to you so that you can view all of these sources. But the fundamental takeaway here is less about the actual data quality components and more getting you to think about defining what data quality means in your organization. You really want to think of it as data that is fit for use, that is documented, that can be used for its intended purpose with confidence. And this is really important because there is a trust problem with data writ large. Many people do not trust data or more advanced data-based technologies like AI today. And so establishing and documenting these data quality standards on behalf of every data domain is a really important step. Now, you might be wondering, what does this all look like in an architecture environment? And this is a case study of data mesh at JP Morgan. You can see the full blog post on how JP Morgan built data mesh architecture at the link below. There is a case study on the AWS blog about this, but you can see at a high level how it works. So you have your business processes, that is part of data governance. And then you also have underneath operational systems where those processes get automated. And then you can see that JP Morgan set up product specific data lakes in their environment. So you can see 3 data lakes here, not just one. You also notice here that each data lake has its own catalog, and all of these domain specific catalogs feed into the mesh catalog. And so that is where there's that holistic environment, and then all of these consuming applications derive their data from the mesh catalog. And so you can see how all of these pieces fit together. And again, that's really important because the mesh catalog is not in itself the be all end all, but it is that consistent, stable source of truth for data across the organization. And so then when you have these consuming applications, there is no question about what's the source data, where did it come from, where did you pull it from. If you have a singular catalog that is ingesting all of your smaller lake catalogs, then you have a pretty clear file path of what occurred and when. And this is another illustration of the data mesh at JP Morgan in more detail. You have your product owners who are your data stewards, and they are the ones who are describing and classifying the business data. You then also have these people who approve requests for data within the data mesh catalog. You have an enterprise-wide data catalog that is managed as well. And then you also have the consumer side of it. So you have people who know where their data lives and they know who to go to for it. That's the other key aspect, is that we talked earlier about how the top-down approach to data governance and management does not work because there is too much data produced for one chief data officer or one data scientist to own it all, and having them own it all creates backlogs. The risk in decentralizing data ownership is that someone could just not know who to go to at all. But if you have these domain specific product owners and they are clearly identified in the data mesh catalog, and people know who to go to request particular data, you can alleviate a lot of those concerns about getting the data you need at the right time. And so in summary, when we do data mesh well, it does hold the opportunity to let teams access, develop, and manage their data more autonomously. It gives your data stewards an easier way to keep your data secure and improve its quality. But there is a big catch. Data mesh only works if you've done the hard work to create a data-driven culture and automate that culture's standards, and that you do that through data governance. And so I want to thank you again for joining me today. I was really happy to share this information with all of you, and again to see so many people joining from around the world, because that tells me that regardless of where we live, data governance is a problem to be solved that is relevant around the world. And that is exciting to see, because I don't believe that these are unsolvable problems. And I think the more that we have dialogues about how to not just co-create governance governance standards, but then to embed them into our environments and our pipelines, we will be able to make a lot more progress. As mentioned, there is a link here to my book on this subject of designing data governance here. And if you enjoyed this talk and would like to learn more about the subject of designing data governance, I would love for you to purchase the book and write a review. I am also on LinkedIn under my full name, and I would love to connect with any of you. So I want to thank you again for joining me today, and I will briefly turn it back to CD for closing remarks.
Thank you, Lauren. It was a very insightful session, and especially I had no idea what data governance is, so I got to learn a lot from you, and I'm definitely looking forward to purchasing your book and learning more about it. So we have got a lot of questions for you, so I'll be directing them your way. So we have a question that says, once you collect this governance data, where does all this governance data go? Whom do you report this governance data to?
Yep, that's a great question. So there's a chapter in the book about establishing a data governance council, which is a governing body within your organization comprised of your data stewards who each own decisions about the data in their respective domains. And in theory, you should be having this governance council, which is the governing body for all of that data in your organization. Now that's an oversimplified answer, because the reality, we said, is a lot more messy due to the cultural challenges of doing data governance well. But in terms of having processes and standards for how to collect and make decisions about data, the ideal way to do that is to have not only your data domains defined and your owners of those domains who can serve as stewards, but then you also have a governing body that is comprised of those domain owners throughout your organization, and ultimately they're the governing body that co-creates those standards that then get automated into your technical environments. These are also the people who know their data well enough to make those decisions about it, such as deciding which metadata gets attached to which pieces of data. And I think the other thing I want to stress again is that when we talk about data stewardship, sometimes that gets misconstrued as non-technical employees becoming data engineers or data scientists, when that is not actually true. You have these domain experts who serve as stewards, who create the standards for data in their domains and make decisions about the data in their domains. But then those standards are the things that get automated by your engineers and your data scientists. So you do want to have a cross-functional governing body to be that source of truth for the data. And setting that up does take time, but you can do iterative approaches to that through proofs of concept and other ways to build out your ideas.
All right, thank you for that answer. The next question is, and I think that the next two questions I think are similar. So the first one is that if your team doesn't trust the government, but you need to report the data to the government, how might that situation even work out? And the next is, if the governing authorities have a history of handling data poorly over time, what is the incentive to keep providing high quality data to them?
I mean, those are both great questions. The reality is that I think what makes data governance so complicated is that you are very often not starting from scratch. You are not creating all of these standards for data quality in a vacuum. The reality is that you probably have more data than you know what to do with already, and it's not beholden to quality standards. And so you're not only thinking about the future, you're thinking about how data has been managed in the past and how it doesn't meet any quality standards. And I think the best way to make that case for why data quality matters is to find tangible ways to show your organization what you lose by having poor quality data. And depending on your role, that's actually a somewhat easy thing to do. I would again reference readers, especially the person who asked that question, to the Harvard Business Review article about how 3% of data produced meets quality standards, because that article goes into much more detail about how you can quantify what quality is and how you can show the concept consequences of poor quality data. And if you are in a data scientist role yourself, you have access to a lot of data, and you would be able to come up with examples of times when pieces of data did not meet quality standards, and you can show what the consequences of that were. I think once the most senior leaders of an organization see what they lose by not implementing quality standards, that is an easier way into having a conversation about what you gain by having quality standards. And we see this with cybersecurity all the time. Nobody thinks they need cybersecurity until there's a breach, until there is a ransom, until there is something kind of catastrophic. I almost think it's human nature for people have to experience catastrophe before they are willing to change. And that sounds really drastic, but I think it often takes something big and negative and sometimes to the point of being a PR blunder that really forces organizations to take some soul searching exercises and change. And so again, I think the easiest way to talk about the value of data quality is to show what you lose by having data that is of poor quality.
Thank you for answering that question. Our next question is, how might you prevent governing authorities from controlling the data access from those who actually need it to do their jobs?
Yeah, that's another great question. And that's why, in a perfect world, decentralization and having data domain ownership is really important, because it, in theory, takes that power away from one and gives it to many. Now, of course, you are, depending on the steward at hand, depending on the data owner at hand, that could be an oversimplified version, because then you are giving authority of data domain decisions to many people, several of whom might have their own motivations for how their data is used, and you are giving these people a lot of power by giving them the authority to access data mesh architecture, to define what different pieces of data mean, to control who has access. And that is, again, why I think it's so important to have clearly defined, documented ways of saying, for instance, what compliance is, and defining who can access which types of data. So, for example, you should not be giving access to your architecture to anyone and everyone. If I, as a service designer, do not have a documented business reason for accessing my client, the PII my client has, I shouldn't be allowed to access it. So data mesh and decentralizing data is not about giving everyone access to all data all the time. It's about having very clearly defined, rational policies for who accesses which data and when and why. And when you have those co-created policies that your data governance council initiates, then that gives any individual data domain owner the ability to reject a request for no reason, or to delay a request for no reason. This is something else that I have seen in my work, is times when clients are very selective about who gets the data they request. If a congressperson requests it, somehow that data is retrieved and gotten to the congressperson within a few hours. If it can be a policy manager at the agency itself, that policy manager might not get the data for a week, they might not get it at all. And it really is about that hierarchical attitude of who deserves data. And that's really what we're trying to get away from with data governance and architecture. I think any new cultural transformation introduces risk. I think there is a risk of too many cooks here. And so again, you have to be really careful and thoughtful about who is your data domain owner and what they have the ability to do. But I think if you have these domain owners within that broader context of data governance standards, that can serve as a checks and balance process.
Another question we have is, how can one properly and ethically destroy governance data?
That's another great question that I talk about in chapter 6 of the book. It's also very common, along with ingesting a lot of data, for organizations to hold on to too much data for too long. And really what that results in is having first of all, having too much data in cloud environments, on servers. That's expensive. Hosting all of that data is expensive. And the reality is that most organizations use a very small percentage of their overall data. So when you host this data consistently on your servers or in your cloud environments, you are not only paying for and wasting money on data that you don't use, but it can actually cause compliance problems because you are maybe holding on to PII that should have been deleted. You are not keeping track of how different data points are used throughout different pipelines, because it's unlikely that one piece of data is only used once and never again. It's more likely that it's utilized throughout your organization in various contexts. And I think you can solve this two ways. One is to have a data retention and destruction policy that you use and update to ensure that you have standards, again, for what gets destroyed and when, for how long you keep data, for how you use it throughout your different pipelines. And then on top of that, you also want to ensure that you have a steward who is on top of regulations and can be on top of things like the, CCPA, the California Consumer Protection Act, or GDPR in Europe. These are relatively young pieces of legislation which give consumers more rights over their data. In the United States, we have very few rights as private consumers, and when it comes to our own data, but I do see data and data ownership as one of the very few issues in American politics that has bipartisan support. And so I do think that over the next several years, companies will have no choice but to create data retention and destruction policies, because that will be required. And I hope that will be required in the context of citizens' rights, because data has already been used as an asset and a product for years, whether we like it or not. And regulation is not always the answer. But I do think it really starts with experts like you all, who are data scientists, who know you're the experts on how to do this work well. And if you can be more involved in these governance conversations about what those standards should be, I think we'll make a lot more progress than that top-down regulatory approach.
That was really interesting. Another question we have is how much does it cost to ask a freelancer to help your startup govern your data?
That's another great question. Because the reality is, I think a lot of the conversations about data mesh governance, federated governance, are centered on at least medium-sized businesses of 100 or more people, if not realistically businesses with thousands of people. The whole concept assumes that you have the resources to help you implement this. And the reality is that if you're a startup, you might be very short on resources. Having said that, I do think that there's a great opportunity to bring in help from outside. I don't have an estimate for what the cost would be to get someone to help with governance at a consulting level, but I do think that that's an approach worth pursuing, rather than hiring, a data governance executive. If you don't have the budget for a chief data officer, I do think it's worth looking into opportunities to hire data governance consultants who can come in, audit what you have, and then help you establish those standards. So that's certainly a path that you can take if you don't feel like you have all of the support in terms of people or systems within your organization as it exists today. And I will say too that LinkedIn is, as the feeds have become more curated and tailored to your own professional interests, data governance is a somewhat common topic on LinkedIn, and there are several groups on LinkedIn that discuss data governance. And so I do think that that exploring LinkedIn and finding people who have that expertise could be a great way of making progress on these efforts.
Thank you. Those were some really insightful answers again. Another question we have is what is a data mesh, and if you could define it further for them.
So data mesh, like we talked about, is decentralized architecture. It is also not a singular tool, role, or technique. It is fundamentally a attitude, philosophy that promotes a data as products mindset. And so instead of simply providing data as a service throughout your architecture and pipelines, you instead manage different data domains as their own products with their own catalogs in their own data lakes. And then all of that feeds into one data mesh architecture environment, which everyone accesses and which is the single source of truth for all the data in your organization.
Thank you for answering that question. Next question we have is, which governing entities need data reporting?
It depends on which sector you're in. I am interpreting this question to mean which industries need governance the most. And I would say that if you work in an industry which is already highly regulated, you are overdue for data governance if you don't have it already. Some examples in the United States of more regulated industries are healthcare, education, finance. These are organizations which hold large amounts of personally identifiable data, which is highly valuable if sold on a dark market. So for instance, these are organizations that very often have American citizens' social security numbers. And if someone got hold of a person's social security number, they could steal their identity. And so it's very important to keep that data private and to have ways of governing it. And so in that context, it's really essential to have governance policies if you are in a highly regulated environment.
And that was really interesting. The next question we have is, what is GDPR and what does the business owner and developer need to know to do the development work?
So GDPR is legislation in Europe which gives consumers that live in Europe rights to access information about how their data is used by businesses. And so if you, as an example, as a business owner, have used a private citizen's data for your own marketing purposes, that citizen has the right to contact you and get a report on how you utilized their data in the business context. And if you are found to have misused their data, you are eligible for a fine of up to 6% of your annual revenue. And large organizations like Facebook and Google can pay these easily, but that's the sort of fine that could sink a smaller mid-sized business. It could sink the average business. And so you are beholden to GDPR legislation, whether your organization exists in the European Union or not. So if you have data in your possession on any EU citizens, you are also at risk of falling out of compliance with GDPR. Of course, this depends on someone actually contacting your business and asking you how you used their data. And the reality is that may or may not occur, but you are still responsible for managing data about EU citizens in compliance with GDPR. And if you are found to not be in compliance, then you can incur a fine that could be very costly for your business.
Thank you for answering that question. Another question we have is, what are the roles and activities of a data owner?
So a data owner is somebody who really makes decisions about the data in their respective domains and assesses whether it is fit for use. And so we talked earlier in this discussion about data quality standards and making sure that those are as uniform as they can be across the business. And so that really goes into what we discussed. They are the people who are making key decisions about the data in their core lines of business.
Thank you for answering that question. The next question we have is, how do you determine if the data has been plagiarized or not?
I don't quite understand the question. Do they mean stolen?
I feel like they're asking, how do we know if like the data has been tampered with or not, I guess.
So there's too much variance to answer that question specifically. Again, that's why it's really important to establish these standards for quality and what it means in your organization. And there are templates and blueprints out there to establish data quality. If you're working in a client environment, it's really important to have these conversations about what quality means to them. And if you are working in-house, you can also figure out what those quality standards should be. But you should absolutely have exercises which validate if data is fit for use.
All right. Thank you so much for answering all those questions. I don't see any other questions. I would like to thank Lauren for taking out time and giving a wonderful presentation and taking out extra time for addressing everyone's questions. So thank you so much, Lauren. I would also like to thank our attendees for taking out their time and joining us from various different locations. And I would also like to thank Stephanie and Bissy, who are part of the team and who have really helped us in this event. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. And I guess we can wrap up this event now. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.